Okay, so the purpose of this meeting is for us to go over the architecture of Gemp a little bit, just give a background to the entire code base, go over how to set up a local version of Gemp, and otherwise just kind of investigate how exactly one can contribute to developing and implementing cards and other such features into Gemp itself. With me today I have Tunidan, so he'll be asking questions as they come up. And if you're watching this in a video form, feel free to leave any comments in below, I guess, and I will try to get to them as I get to them. So, Tunidan, let me know, like, what do you know? Like, let me get a handle on what exactly you've already figured out.
Not much. I've worked a tiny bit with Java, but that's about it.
Okay, and have you looked into the Gemp like repository or anything like that?
Yeah, I looked into some of the stuff on GitHub, but mostly out of curiosity more than anything else.
Right.
Like I
So,
looked at I think a couple of the card definitions, but
right.
I wasn't exactly sure what everything is.
Yeah, and that's definitely understandable. So on the PC GitHub account, we've got the Gemplotter project. This is the one that we treat as master. There is technically another one that this one thinks is master, which is attached to my username right now. That is the original one that Marcin S. used to work on, and I just haven't gotten all the bookkeeping figured out to get these two swapped so that this is the official one. But this is the one that matters. This is the one that we push out. Relative to recently, I updated the README on this, so it should have a pretty decent summary here of the kind of things that you might want to look into. But I'll be going over most of the stuff today anyway. And then for the purposes of getting set up, there is a abbreviated summary tutorial on that README, and there's also a more specific advanced one within the Docker folder of the project. And so this has more details and more specific things to go into.
I'm trying to find that right now.
I'll be going over that as well. But yeah, let's just go ahead and start with that, with the setup, since that's always going to be useful, having a local version of Gemp to be testing your changes on. We do have playtest versions of Gemp, 3 different instances that you can push to, but that's always a drag and makes development much slower when you have to wait on code to be deployed and then recompiled remotely and all that jazz. So let me just basically go over the steps that we have here. So first of all, I have done the work to make sure that Gemp can run within a container on Docker. If you're not familiar with containers, they are sort of like virtual machines in that they introduce a layer in between your program and the computer that it is running on. That layer defines a computer. Basically, it's got a file system, it's got default installed programs. The ones that we use imitate a Linux distribution. And then within the Docker ecosystem, with these Docker instruction files, you can tell it to specifically install all of the various prerequisites. So we have one that installs Java as well as Maven and Apache, because Gemp expects Apache to be there, and a few other odds and ends, so that this way you don't have to do all those steps yourself. It handles all of that. So the very first thing that you have to do is you have to install Docker. If you're on Windows, that's going to be the Docker desktop package. So this is just fairly simple to just go and, search for that and download it. Hang on 1 second.
The logo looks something like a whale, I'm assuming.
Yep, yeah, it looks kind of like a whale. Yeah, that's it. Yep, so there'll be a download link there, so you just download and install Docker Desktop. And then you're also going to want to get some way of managing the containers. It comes with a really crappy manager. I forget what it's called, doesn't really matter. I hate it though. It doesn't actually let you do much within it, and it expects you to basically know how to use the command line. So I prefer to install this tool called portainer.io. So you can get that by going to that website, portainer.io, and it will give you the instructions. Just hit start for free because they have a paid version as well. Okay, they've changed this a little bit. Great. They're doing this sort of thing where they have you sign up first. Well, I hope that that does not actually get in the way because this is a fantastic tool. Okay, there's an install button up here. Community Edition, there we go. So over here, install Portainer CE now. I'm pretty sure you just go here and this is going to give you instructions on what to do. This itself is also installed via Docker. So basically you're going to be getting the instructions on what Docker commands to run, and it'll eventually, in one of these tutorials, it'll eventually get down to the point where you are running specific things. So yeah, here's the instructions on how to get Portainer IO installed, and so it'll just give you the specific commands to run in your command line. You do all that and it'll show up. So to demonstrate that, I have this local version of Docker running. You can see this is on my local host 9000, and I have a user already set up.
So does Docker run on your browser or on your desktop?
It runs on your computer, on your desktop. Yeah, you access it. Well, so normally when you're accessing Docker, on Docker desktop, you're going to be doing so through something like this. This is the Docker desktop panel, but like I said, the tools that are in here are not fantastic, so I avoid using that as much as possible. Portainer.io, on the other hand, once it is installed, and you can see that I'm not accessing the remote URL. This is through the Portainer container that is on my local Docker. You can have all kinds of stuff installed. So I have Portainer itself installed, and then right here I have an instance of Gemp and an instance of Gemp's database. I've also got a whole bunch of other stuff because I use this for all kinds of development. But so once you've done that, so once you've got Docker and you've got your Portainer.io installed, then you're going to want to go ahead and pull down the Git repository. So that is done. If you don't have Git installed, you're going to have to go install it as well. That's just going to be getting the Git for Windows package if you're on Windows. If you're on Linux, I assume you know where you're going. And then once you've done that, you're going to run that command that I've got listed here, git clone, and then pulling from the Players Council repository, and that will give you just a local directory where you've now got the files for Gemp.
Okay.
So at this point, you will be manually building and putting the containers up. So at first, Portainer doesn't have anything listed in here because it for you at least, no containers would exist. So the way that gets fixed is by, in the instructions, I believe you just go into the Docker folder. That's right. So you'll end up going into the Docker folder. You will open up a command line of your choice, and you will run these commands here. So in my case, ignore this one here because I'm going to bring the Gemp down real quick. So this command, we can now see that my Gemp instances are not running. All we've got is Portainer. Everything else may as well not exist. So that command that we're going to run is docker compose up -d for detach. If you don't do that -d, then what's going to happen is that you're going to see everything running in your command line. This just makes it so that it runs and then exits, so that you can use the command line for other stuff. So if we come back over here into Portainer and we hit our little refresh button up here, we will see that now the Gemp app and Gemp DB containers have been created. Now, when you do this the very first time, it's going to take about 15 minutes to download and install all the various prerequisites, creating the container for the very first time. After that, however, Docker keeps what are called images, which are snapshots basically of the configurations, so that you don't have to keep doing that every single time. But that first time it will take a while.
Okay.
So we can see here that starting Gemp app and starting Gemp DB, it looks like this. It shows up in green if you're using a decent command line interface. And then after that, so at this point then, the database should be completely created. The application, on the other hand, is going to be is going to need a little more work. So I give instructions here for how to connect to the database. Just to run through it real quick. Let me pull up my dbeaver. So you'll want to install a database manager. I think that dbeaver is one of the best options. I've, again, tried dozens of these, and I have not found one that was any decent until I found this one. Wait for this to finish starting up. And then what you're going to do is you're going to come over here and you're going to open up a new database connection. And this is going to ask you what kind of database it is. It's going to be MariaDB. That is the type of database that is being used by Gemp. And then you're going to want to put in some information. So over here, by default, the database is going to be exposed on localhost 35001. So you're going to put the 35001 over here. And then by default, you're going to use the Gemp username and password of Gemp user and Gemp password. Obviously, if you're going to try and host this on an actual production server that is accessed by other places, then you're going to want to change these as we have for our PC instances. But you're just going to come over here and put the Gemp user and Gemp password over here. And then you can do there's a test. Where's the test? Test connection right here. Access denied for Gemp user. I've probably messed with the passwords and such on my local version because this was actually where I tested doing all those password changes first. But you should get a green, access approved, like this works sort of thing. And then you just hit finish, and it will add a completely new instance right there. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. Okay, so all right, so this localhost over here. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? Did I bring them back up? Yeah, they're up. Why isn't it? Oh, it's this one, local Gemp. Okay, so once you've actually signed in correctly and you have not clicked on all the various wrong ones that you have configured, if you're able to access this, and then when you open up the databases section, it shows GempDB. That's how you know that the database is fully set up. It'll have all these different tables that represent all the different players that are registered, the game history, all that kind of jazz. So that's for the database, and then for the actual application. Sorry about that. I was trying to not close the door because it is way hot down here. It's 80 degrees here in my house, let alone how hot it is outside. But people are being too loud, so I'll just have to sweat through it. All right, so all right, so that's the database, like I said. So as for the application, there's a few more steps that have to be done. So first, we are going to log into the instance itself using Portainer. And then we'll come over here and we will click on this little icon. That is the console icon. So if we click on connect, this will give us a command line that is inside the container, if that makes sense. So this is basically going to be a Linux instance that, as far as it is aware, is a computer, right? It's not quite a virtual machine. It's not quite as fully fledged as a virtual machine would be, but as you know, it's pretty close for our purposes. So if we let's see. So if you change to the etc Gemp Loader directory here, this you will notice if you look at the names here, these are going to match up with what are in this folder right here. So this is basically going to be a mirror between what's on your hard drive here and what's on the container. And it is set up specifically so that you can like copy paste stuff back and forth because there's going to be things like logs and database output and stuff like that you're going to want to be able to transfer. But so continuing on down, we are going to want to compile it. That's right. So the very first time that we compile this, it's going to take a little while. But after you've done that, it's pretty quick. So that is just mvn install. And the very first time, like I said, this is going to download a bunch of stuff. It's going to do all kinds of things. Actually, this is looking like a brand new installation. Hang on a minute. Oh, wait a minute. I know what happened. So a little while ago, I was actually recreating brand new containers from scratch because I was double checking that everything worked when you did it from scratch. So I just need to redo the up. Is it build? So I have to make sure that it rebuilds from the actual local one that I care about, and then compose up. There we go. All right, so oh boy. Huh. Well, all right. Well, this is what it looks like. I am a little bit concerned that it is doing everything from scratch, considering that this is supposed to be an existing instance. I hope I didn't nuke my local instance. Or this is going to take a while because this process takes about 10 to 15 minutes. On top of the original container build, you also have to do an initial build of Gemp itself, and that takes a little while. Well, I might just end up letting this run in the background while we're talking. Darn, I should have checked that before. At any rate, once you've done that, you should see a green build success show up eventually once it gets everything figured out. And then after that point, there is going to be a line that you have to change in the Docker Compose. So to show that off, zoom in a little bit here and get the Docker Compose. So this file here, the Docker Compose, this file defines all of the different configuration bits of the containers. So over here we have the database container, and then up here we have the actual Gemp container itself. It tells it what ports need to be forwarded. It tells it what directories need to be bound between the inner container and the outer computer. And by default, this line here is going to be commented out because this is telling it that when the container starts, you need to look for the web.jar and run it. And the very first time that you build your container, it's not going to have that jar. So if you had this, it would just get stuck in an infinite loop of trying and failing to start up. So we leave that off, and then once everything is built, you come in here and you uncomment this, save it, and then do a Docker Compose down, Docker Compose up, and that will recreate the container in a way that mimics what actually happens in production, where it will every time the container turns on, it will attempt to run that jar.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just have to wait for this to finish. That's going to be a while. After that, you should have an instance of Gemp running. There's not much else to it. I've kind of meddled back and forth because I had those interruptions and stuff, but the number of steps involved is not very much. And like I said, just recently I confirmed that you can do this from a completely blank setup, and it just works. There's no additional configuration beyond what's in these steps.
Unfortunately, we have to prove it right now.
Yeah, I know, right? So that's going to be a bit of a drag. All right, so while we're waiting on that, so do you have any questions about the setup then?
No, it seems fairly straightforward, and if I have any problems, I can just go back and reference this video.
Yep, and also feel free to bring up any questions in the Gemp dev environment, and we can go over it. So in the meantime, let's go over some of the architecture here and talk about the different parts of Gemp and where you would look to solve different problems and so forth. So here you can see that there are different packages within Gemp. You have the async, cards, common, images, logic, and server. Images is out of date. This was a project that Marcinus put together that is basically a card generator, but we already have our card generator, and it reads from a spreadsheet as opposed to JSON like his did. And I developed mine before I knew about his, so oh well. As for these other pieces, async is going to control two things. First, if you look down here in the web folder, this is basically the entire website. If you go through here, you'll find
Okay.
that there are like different JSON or JavaScript files, the actual HTML files. Um, there are some images like for things like the culture symbols, um, other kind of hard coded situations like that. And so when Gemp is hosted, this is the exact folder that it is looking at when it is serving the files um, here. Let me come on. So all this HTML that's where this is stored, and then the other part of it, the actual Java side, within the JavaScript. If we drill down here to the communication.js, all throughout the front end, the client, there will be things that eventually need to ping the server or get information from the server or just report something to the server, and they will do so through this communication.js mess. And so
That's basically your whole error catching system right there.
not error catching. This is the communication system. This is how
Okay.
things go back and forth between the client and the server. So
Okay.
these are all these JavaScript functions are going to be wrappers for things that you can actually do in Gemp. So for instance, right here we can see the send chat message. If somebody's trying to send a chat message, it's going to like this encapsulates the specific URL that needs to be gone to, all the different arguments that are going to be sent, whether it's post or get, all the different details are going to be held there. And then that is going to end up handled over here in the Java part of async. So in this project, it's going to take every request and look at the URL and say, okay, well, is it the Hall URL? Well, then that's going to go to the Hall request manager. Is it handling DEX? Then we're going to go to the DEC request handler. And so this is the place that you can look to find where those individual requests end up routed to in the Java code itself. So if we were trying to find chat, for instance, I bet that there is a chat URL, and then we can see that there's a chat request handler, and we can go to the implementation. And so this right here is where the JavaScript code ultimately terminates. And so you can use that to trace where exactly the chat messages end up going. So that's async, handling the client and handling the communication for the client. But it doesn't actually do anything beyond that because everything is ultimately going to go to one of these other parts of the server. It's just going to be a router is all that it is. Gemp loader cards is I've forced this to be the location where all of the data cards, all the data files are stored. That does include cards. So we have a subfolder here divided between official and unofficial. So we have PC cards are stored down here on the unofficial side. Oops, no, I don't know what I'm moving anything. So our errata, for instance, are stored in these different JSON files. The official ones have sections set up for those cards.
I think that's the section that I looked over, and it seemed relatively straightforward.
Yep, it's the difficult part about making cards is knowing what's available. But it's not actually all that hard once you know some of the caveats. Because unlike code, where you can compile it and then the computer will tell you whether or not there was an error, with the JSON, there's nothing doing that. You just have to kind of load Gemp and see if it complains about it when it tries to load it. And that's the step I think that most people are missing when they try to contribute on that. But anyway, so there's other things besides cards in here. We have the definitions for different products, like all the different booster packs and so forth, both for sealed and non-sealed. The MyCard stuff is all in here. Draft definitions are in here. The different sealed formats that have been put together for the sealed gala. Nelson is in here adding new stuff all the time. And then the actual definitions for the formats are here. Defining what a set is, all that kind of stuff is somewhere here in this particular location. There's no real Java code. There is. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Never mind. Let me back up a moment. So way back when this project was first started by Marcinez, every single card was coded in Java. So if we head over here, we can see that there's individual classes for each of these cards that are still in Java. So this particular one is filled with fear. This worked for him while he was the only one working on Gemp. If there was a bug, he would come in and fix it. But any kind of bug fixes required that he go in and restart the server and recompile and do all that. And for the initial batch of Decipher cards, that wasn't a problem. But once they started doing some of the second edition stuff, I think that started to become a bit of a drag when there were multiple people working on cards and multiple people reporting bugs. And every time there was a bug, you had to restart the server, which meant that you had to wait for everybody to stop their games. And so it became a bit of a drag. So what he did was he developed a new system where all cards were instead defined via JSON, and in those, and then you could set up the server to just reload the definitions. Since it's just a text file that's being read, it would regenerate the definitions of what a card is. And so this system is much more flexible and much better.
It does sound a lot more simple.
Yeah. So because of that, not all of the cards are in JSON, obviously. He started with all the small sets. So set 0, set 19, set 9, set 14, set 16, those are all converted. And then he's also got his way through all of set 1, and then it's part of set 2 that is still in Java. So we can see that he got through the elves, the dwarves, Gandalf, Isengard, got through a few different things on set 2, but the rest of it is still remaining that is yet to be converted.
But we don't have to worry about that because everything, as far as we know, works flawlessly.
I know for a fact it does not. There are plenty of card bugs that get reported from time to time. Some of them I have not been able to figure out yet. Relentless Warg is one of them from set 18. I have looked through the code. I cannot figure out why on earth it's acting the way it does. And I'm absolutely certain that there are other bugs that are like just kind of lurking and either nobody notices or it's a card that nobody has ever used. In fact, until very, very recently, there was a bug with Dwarven Axe that ignored the one of the rulings that Decipher had made.
I remember that.
Yeah. So I went in and fixed that while I was doing the errata for it. And so like stuff like that is in JSON. Yeah, stuff like that is no doubt lurking everywhere. It's it's not uncommon, I'm pretty sure. But so eventually, we will get around to converting all of these to using the JSON format. It's much better for them to all be in JSON for a couple of different reasons. One being that if there's a bug that is found, we can fix it without needing to restart the server. But the second reason for it is actually because it forces the cards to all use shared functionality. To use an example here, one of the errata that I wanted to do that has not yet been performed was for Horn of Helm, that altered the behavior of what happens when you are trying to spot a number of Free People's cards. So any card that says, if you can spot 4 Free People's cultures, do this.
Right, you were talking about how every card does it differently.
Every single one of those cards is outside of the range, because they're like set 4 and above. Every single one did it individually its own way. Most of these sorts of functions are in a shared location, so like there will be a utility somewhere that calculates how many cultures there are and then returns the number. But that did not happen for any of these. Every single one of these cards manually checks every single card that is on the table and then counts up the cultures however it needs to do it. Which means that I need to convert 4 or 5 cards, however many there are, to JSON before and make sure that all of them are using the same shared function, so that I can take that function and make it aware of cards like Horn of Helm that are able to subtract from that number. Because that is essentially how any of those sorts of functions happen, is that you have the original base functionality that knows of an exception and checks for it at the time that it's adding up all of its stuff. Anyway, so we'll get there. There are some changes that I want to make to the functionality. One of the things that you may notice if you're familiar with JSON is that we are not actually using regular JSON. What we are using is a variant called HJSON.
I don't know anything about JSON, but it does say HJSON instead of JSON, so that's simple enough to notice.
Yep. So if I pull up this lot of formats, this is actually one that I've not yet converted. you'll notice a few things. You'll see that there are quotes around every single name, and you'll see that there are commas at the end of every line. Things like that are frequent sources of errors, and they are almost never actually ambiguous. So what HJSON does is it just says, okay, we're not going to worry about that. We are just going to assume that the quotes are there if they need to be. And so like removing that just removes a whole lot of typing that you got to do, and removes a very frequent source. I can't tell you the number of times that I meant for there to be a comma and there wasn't, and then Gemp would complain about it because it couldn't parse the JSON, and it was a mess. But my favorite particular feature here is the ability to comment stuff out. That is not actually built into JSON, and the number of times that I wanted to say, okay, this isn't working, I can't figure out why it's not working, let's comment out everything except for this one section that I know works and move on from there, and I couldn't do it. So I finally got fed up and translated almost everything over over to HJSON. If you
that has
are
been very useful.
Yeah, it's super good. There's a website for it. If you just search for HJSON, you'll find it. It talks about all the different features that it has, and it also gives links to there are different packages for how to use it. So we use the Java package, but more than that, there's also a, where is it? I know that there's a page on here for editors. Just users. There we go. Editor support. So depending on what particular text editor that you use, I use Sublime Text. It gives you a package for you to install so that when you are using it, it actually does the syntax highlighting. So you can see that these are purple and these are green. So that way you know that you're doing it properly as you're typing everything up. So this will do things like if I try to put in another exit curly here, it knows that that's wrong because there's no open somewhere else, so it highlights it in purple. Stuff like that is very useful.
I think that I've used an IDE or two like that.
Yeah, so you should be able to find whichever particular editor you use. You should be able to find something there for that. This is still running. Oh, but it's actually gotten to the point of actually building. So here we can actually see what it's doing. We caught it right at the moment where it is loading cards. So first it loads all the JSON cards from all the text files, and then it goes and loads the individual cards from the individual sets. And this is another situation where it takes a long time the very first time that this happens, and every time after that, if there are cards that haven't changed, it just uses the cached version that it built before, so it goes much smoother. But yeah, eventually we will get this to where it's all JSON text files, but it is not this day. So what's next? All right, so that's the cards package. Common is pretty straightforward. This is just for various utilities that are going to be used in all sorts of places. For instance, this is where the definitions for card types and cultures, so your enums and such. So all sorts of places are going to want to know about the different kinds of cultures, and so that's stored here. But this is mostly just a coding thing that is used by other locations. I mentioned the images one. We don't really use that nowadays. And then there's logic and server are the last two. So logic is the container for all the things that Gemp actually does when it's playing a game. We're talking about understanding what a skirmish is and understanding how characters can be wounded and all that sort of jazz. That is handled by the logic section. If you're just building cards, you're probably not going to spend much time in there, but that is probably where the actual game execution is going to be occurring. And then server is everything else. Basically, this is going to be the entry point of the program. This is the actual thing that is running in the Docker container. This is where the chat server is instantiated. This is where the Hall server is instantiated. This is the thing that is going to be controlling all the different games and the tables. It's going to be taking a bunch of messages from the async communication and routing it to the proper game, making sure that the right game gets the right instructions, all that kind of stuff. So this is mostly like a meta overview kind of package. So we can see here that there's handling for leagues, there's stuff for the merchant. If you're opening up packs, it's going to handle that. If you're opening up, if you're looking at your collection, then it's going to have controllers for that and stuff like that.
So I'd
So
assume that's where the animations of like wounds being placed and everything else are
nope.
occurring. Oh, that's in the
That
logic?
is one no, that is 100% a client thing. Um,
Okay.
on the server side, the server has no idea about images whatsoever. It
Okay.
doesn't know that cards have a portrait or anything. It knows that cards have stats, and it knows how to run the game. Um, and it knows, for instance, at a particular time that, so for instance, let's say that we have Intimidate on the table or in someone's hand, which reacts to somebody wounding. The server is going to know that there are cards that can react to someone wounding. So when someone gets wounded, it's going to emit a person wounded event, and then it's going to look through all the cards that are currently in play or active and check to see, do any of these actually handle wounds getting handled, and it'll notice that Intimidate is there and say, okay, you need to receive this message that someone's about to get wounded. Do you want to activate? And that will go down to the client, and the client will handle it. But as far as the visual stuff goes, no, that is 100% the stuff that is stored in async, inside the web part, the
Okay.
JavaScript and the HTML there. In fact, almost all of that is going to be in GameUI.js, which is a complete fustercluck. Um, any of you who are familiar with actual web development, Marcinus was not a fan of the web, and it kind of shows. And it doesn't actually follow any good design patterns or anything like that. It's just kind of as much code as possible slapped in the same place. But so this all handles the displaying of decisions and handles the animations if necessary. But that's all 100% client side. So actually, you could theoretically make a different client. And in fact, the Star Wars guys have done this with their Gemp. They have a Unity based client that is just a program that you install on your computer, and it is able to handle its own animations and does things differently. The server doesn't care one way or the other. All it cares about is making sure that these things called cards get moved to the right regions and stuff like that. But it doesn't know what any of that means.
Okay.
And let's see if that thing is finished. Nope, still going. Okay, so that is, if you're not going to be looking into adding additional features and stuff like that, most of that is going to just be a curiosity. For most people that are looking to make cards, you're going to be spending most of your time here in the Gemp Loader cards. So let me look at the documentation that I've got. So here, I have spent some time trying to record what all of the different things in the JSON does, and I have finished it for everything except for effects, which is kind of a big thing to be missing. But in this document, this will kind of tell you what exactly is needed to define a card. So if we let's walk through an example here. Let's pull up Axe Strike. That's as good as any. So in the card definition, you're going to have the ID of the card, which is always going to follow this format where you have the number of the set that it is in, followed by an underscore, followed by the number, the card number within that set. You can kind of think of this as a placeholder for the rarity if you want. And it also doesn't include any padded zeros in either place. This is going to be the ID by which the card is known. This is actually something. This is one of the things that I want to change with the JSON. I don't like that the definition itself has to come up with what the name is. It should be able to generate that. But anyway, once you have that, then you're going to have to define a number of stats about your card, including things like your title, culture, twilight cost. And then the big one that you're going to be dealing with most of the time is this here, this effects object or array. If you have multiple effects on a card, you're going to end up making this into an array of things. And so you'll have your first item and then your second item, depending on what things it is that particular card does. But so if we hop over here, we can see that this particular section here, top level blueprint, is going to describe all the stuff that is going to be on that first indentation, all the things that have to be at this top level. So we can see that you can define a title, subtitle, whether or not it is unique. what side the card is on, which most of the time can be automatically generated. Golem cards are the only ones where you have to define the side.
Yeah, naturally.
Yeah. And in the future, there might be other situations where it is ambiguous and the system can't figure it out. But I all of the ones that I generate include those. If we hop over to one of the errata cards, we'll see that there's a lot more information in the ones I generate. And that one doesn't have it. Shoot. Oh well. I was pretty sure that the one that I had... there we go. So those ones were generated using an older version. So it doesn't hurt it to have it there, and the ones that I generate do use that. Culture is one that you can include there. Type is going to be straightforward. It's going to use all of these that are here. There's also an unused adventure card. I'm not quite sure what that was supposed to be, but it is there.
Same with the Fallen Realms culture.
Yeah, I assume that this was started out as... I know that it started out as a Gempuka project, but I think at one point he must have flirted with doing Magic the Gathering as well, but at any rate. Race, item class, keyword, the Twilight cost, the various stats, strength, resistance, and all that. So you can see that this is just a comprehensive list of all the things that you might possibly mention. So in the case of possessions, for instance, you will define a target. So this is equivalent to bearer must be Gimli sort of thing. And then these ones are going to repeat a lot. Requires and effects. You're going to see this at different levels of the JSON definition. Requires is a list of things that have to be true for this particular thing to be used. So in the case of a card, that's going to be represented as to play spot an X. But in the context of like an action, for instance, it might be if you can spot 3 burdens, then you may do this sort of thing. And then the other is the effects array, which I mentioned, which can be as many different effects as you want. They'll be listed down here. But I've also been expanding this a little bit because there are some things that should be in there that are not. For instance, here, all the ones that I generate include the game text, the lore, promo text, and things like that. The fact that cards...
Is the syntax for game text the same as for Nandak?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, we need to convert them here, I think, to use pure HTML. I have a bunch of like for instance, you can put a backslash to indicate a new line in NewDeck or in Nandeck. Eventually, once we're actually using this section, I will probably add Nandeck handling so that, because inevitably people are just going to copy paste. I mean, heck, that's all this is doing, is that I wrote a script that will copy paste all the stuff from a Nandeck spreadsheet into these, and that's why they're all there.
I'm just thinking for the game text, it really makes sense to include that because people have always wanted a translation for Tengwar, and you've talked about adding like Polish cards and whatnot.
Exactly. The absence of this data is why Tengwar cards can't show that information. Like I said, the server doesn't know what it's doing as far as cards are concerned. It doesn't know what a card is. It has no idea that game text is associated with a card. All it knows are these effects. And so this is one of the things that I will want to be changing in the future, is making sure that there are definitions for every single card, and maybe even just stub definitions for the ones that are implemented in Java that have this sort of metadata, so that we can do things like hover over a Tengwar image and it switches over to show you what the English is, or when you right click on something it shows you a translation in your language of choice. Anyway, so from there, the thing to look at, let's go back to our example. Got sidetracked a little bit. Okay, so we have these effects. Effects are going to have different types. This is probably one of those things I need to rename. Marston had a problem of giving multiple things the same name.
Oh, that's never good.
Yeah, and I came in here and I knocked a bunch of them out. For instance, there were 2 different things called cost. You had costs for an action, and you also had the Twilight cost on a card. I would get those mixed up all the time.
Why would you name them the same thing?
Well, yeah, that was my thing. Requires used to be condition, which We have things in the game called conditions. You cannot have these two different things that have the same. And I suspect we probably need to call this something besides effects, because effects have effects, right? So something's I don't know, something's weird with the terminology. At any rate, though, there will be different types of effects that you can define, and those are all listed in here. The big ones to know are activated, which is going to be the same thing as a special ability, something with the bold text skirmish. That's going to be an activated. Trigger is going to be just about anything that is each time while. Those are going to be handled there. If you are specifically making an event, there's a special event effect type that you have to use, because there's logic that comes from needing to know that this is going to be activated from the hand as well, instead of being on the table, stuff like that. And then there's a bunch of these others that are specific. Most of these are edge cases. They're things that you don't see very often, like in-hand trigger. There's not many cards that have a trigger, like, for instance, this one here, the Witch King Black Lord.
Yeah.
Each time a companion is played, you may reveal this card from hand. Most of the time when you have a card like that, it's not supposed to... It has to be in play and active for that text to be active, but that's not going to be the case if it's in hand. So... most of these are just special cases like that. And then so if we hop back over to our example, this axe strike has a type of event, because it is in fact an event. And then, so most of these other ones become more obvious once you've actually tried to use them. So for instance, duration resolution, if you have an effect that lasts for a certain amount of time until such and such an event, this defines exactly how you need to write that. There's different sections for if you're trying to resolve a particular player, which player is it that is going to be making this decision or having this effect happen to them. Sometimes it can be difficult to think about that, where especially in situations where it says make the Free People's player do something, or if it just says draw a card. Who is it that's drawing a card? Well, usually it's the owner, right? So there's a shorthand for that, you, the person that is using it. But there can be complicated situations where you want to do you, not you. You might want to specify shadow player. You might want to specify the Free People's player. You might want to look in memory at a particular card that you saved before and say, well, actually, we want the owner of that card to do it. So that sort of thing will show up. But I'm getting sidetracked here. So when we're doing for this axe strike, we're doing a modify strength event. So is that one of the ones that I have? Yes. Okay. So here in modify strength, we know that there are these different arguments that have to be provided. The amount, oh man. So one of the reasons that I built this entire document is because there are some situations, some effects that use amount as a parameter, some that use count, and some, in this case, that use both. And it's never consistent. And so I was constantly running into errors where I used count instead of amount or vice versa. But so in this particular case, what modify strength is expecting is that amount represents the specific number. So in this case, +2 or -1 or whatever. And count is the number of characters that you are applying it to. So if you had a card that said, make 2 orcs strength +2, then both of those would have an amount of 2 and a count of 2. But if you had something that said, make a dwarf strength +2, then you're going to have amount of 2 and count of 1, if that makes sense.
And it defaults to that, so you don't even have to include it.
Yeah, you don't. Although, I have found that this one is probably an outlier because having amount and count in the same thing can be confusing. But most of the time I find that on many of these that are default, I prefer to include them just in case. Like for instance, add burdens. Technically speaking, the number of burdens that is added by default is 1, but if you don't include the default, then what you end up with is an effect that just says add burdens and nothing else. And I prefer to explicitly have that, amount of 1, that yes, we know that this is 1 burden specifically and not some other magic number. And so strength can be modified until a particular time, and so that's where I was talking about the duration resolution. So you'll come in here and say until the end of the turn, until the end of this particular phase, This is one that defaults to until the end of the current phase, like all durations do. Memorize, if the player had to choose or actually even in the case where it didn't, when this affects a card, it can optionally memorize what card it affected. This will be used quite a bit in situations like exert a dwarf to do something and then come back and do something else to that dwarf. So in those situations, you're going to want to memorize which dwarf got exerted at first. And then we have the filter. So you will spend a lot of time trying to figure out the right filter for particular actions. If we hop over here, we will see the filter is choose dwarf. This is another situation where we have two things given the exact same name and they need to be differentiated. I have not yet differentiated them because it's much more tricky than the other ones to figure out which are which automatically. But to give you the brief rundown, one type of filter, which I do actually call filter, is basically just a description of what cards in play need to be affected. The other I refer to as a selector. If you have multiple things that match the filter, how do you differentiate which one needs to be affected? So most of the time, you're going to let the player choose. So here we have this little function that says choose whatever this filter is. So I call the outside part a selector and the inside part the filter.
Okay.
And at some point I will get the actual terminology to match. But so I do call it selector resolution in here. So there are a few different functions that can be used. So you could say all. So if I wanted to say all dwarf, that would affect every single card that is a dwarf. And then there are a couple.
Now, how would you? Hang on. Here's a quick question.
Sure.
For if you wanted to do every dwarven companion but exclude, say, the Thrarin ally, how would you notate that?
I would say all dwarf companion, not name Thrarin. That's how it would end up looking.
Okay, and that would exclude, and even if you're playing the companion Thrarin, it wouldn't allow him to get the bonus.
Correct.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
Or the damage, depending on what you're doing.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Because filters will be used for all kinds of things. Good things, bad things, doesn't matter. These are targets, so it can be attached to all sorts of different effects. So there's a few different shorthands in here. Rather than needing to write out the name of the title of a card or whatever, there's self, meaning that you are affecting the card that is within this definition. So for instance, if we go over to Son of Gloin real quick, we'll see that his ability exerts self and modifies self's strength by +2. So that's just a very quick and easy selector. Bearer is another similar type of shorthand, but it's for possessions that are being borne by someone else. So if we come over to Gimli's Battle Axe, we'll see that this modifies the bearer to be damage +1.
Okay.
Adds that keyword.
So I'm going to guess that the Athelian Blade book that was making Athelian Blade stronger was due to, instead of making the bear stronger, was making self stronger?
Precisely. Yes.
Okay. I was wondering why you had that little snippet at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that was I have ran into that issue multiple times. It's very because bearer doesn't come up all that often, right? It's only when you're dealing with cards that attach to other cards. But there's tons of cards that affect themselves.
Yeah.
Everything from discard this card to do X, or play this card to do X, or affect this card's stats. Like it's very easy typo to make. Anyway, so beyond that, then the big one that you're going to see most of the time is choose, because the vast majority of cards are going to see something like exert an elf to make it strength +2. And so that's only a single elf. If there's multiple elves, then we have to differentiate, and so that differentiator is going to be the player choosing which elf is going to be hit. And then in some cases, you have previously affected a card, and in fact, I think we can even see that in... no, those use self. Here we go. So this is a good example. Battle Fury. That is going to say exert a dwarf to make it strength +3 and damage +1. And so the way that this works is that we have a cost to this effect that is exert choose a dwarf,
Uh-huh.
and then we memorize what that dwarf is. So we save it to data. We save it to memory, I mean. And then there's two different effects. There's going to be a modify strength effect that checks the memory for the exerted dwarf and makes it strength +3. And then we also add a keyword, once again, looking in memory at that exerted dwarf and making it damage +1.
Okay.
Straightforward.
Yeah, that's really, really straightforward.
Yep, happens a lot. And there's no limitations really on what you can call this. This is a variable name, so you can call it whatever you want. I could call it ASDF instead if I was feeling particularly masochistic. So there will be times where you end up having multiple memorizations, and that's fine too. That's why you're able to define a term here, so that you can have multiple variables without tripping over yourself. Let's see. Let's just look for one that's got. So here's one of those requires I was talking about. Here's a dwarf card that requires that you can spot a dwarf to play it. So that goes under the requires section. But he's got no game text, so there's just no effects on this guy.
It just is.
Mm-hmm. So here's an effect type of modifier. So modifiers are going to be, you can think of them as miniature rules. Modifiers are not actually attached to a card. They get instantiated, and then you can almost think of them as invisible cards that continue to exert an effect on the board until the modifier itself decides that it's going to deactivate itself. So most things like, so for instance, the way that this is set up, it's going to automatically know that when this card goes out of play, it's going to take the modifier with it. But in other cases, you can instantiate modifiers, like for instance, the move limit modifiers on Radagast or whatever. That's going to be spawning a modifier that changes the game so long as it's in place. And so this will also be used for things that make someone strength +3 until the regroup phase or something. Or actually, if you had a card that said make all dwarves strength +3 until the regroup phase, that's going to be a modifier that's going to go into play. If dwarves go into play or out of play, they're going to continually still get hit by that modifier, and it's going to change them.
Yeah, a relevant example perhaps for me would be the what was the one card that we designed? The one that Aragorn uses to make Valiant Companions stronger, something like that.
Yeah. So there's a section for modifiers here. There are a number of modifiers that already exist. Most of them are can or can'ts. This card can't be discarded. This card can't be exerted. So like
there's a bucket load of those that goes on the ring bearer every game.
Yep. Yeah. So you'll have Black Breath will use can't remove burdens and can't heal. Those will be in here somewhere. Yeah, can't heal. Yeah, so these are they're straightforward, but modifiers are different from effects, so you'll find them in a different section. Requirements also operate a little bit differently. So requirements are going to have a number of entries in here, but they've also got some like more complicated actions that you can take. So I can compare two numbers. I can make sure that a particular situation is not the case. I can have A or B be true for this to work. So all those functions are listed in here. Triggers. So triggers can get a little complicated. There are before triggers and there are after triggers. Before triggers are about to situations.
Okay.
So if so intimidate, for instance, is going to look and see if someone is about to be wounded. You can prevent it. The big thing with befores is the befores allow you to change what's about to happen. If you are instead doing an after trigger, it cannot actually change the thing occurring. So if a dwarf is wounded, make a strength +2. That's an after trigger because it's not actually changing whether or not that wound got applied.
Yeah, stuff like at the start of or to prevent something, you would want to use a before trigger, but everything else basically falls into the after camp.
Right. If you're not dealing with prevention, then you'll do it in after. Oops. Let's see. And then I think most of it after that is really just kind of being familiar with all the bajillions of effects that exist. Now, because of the way that the JSON stuff works, there's actually kind of two layers to the code itself. The actual execution itself is going to occur here in logic.
Hmm.
In most of these other sections, probably this logic section is where most of it happens. But in this cards.build section, there are wrappers for those actual effects, and so effects have to be defined in both places. And so because of that, there are a good number of effects that exist in the game that are not yet accessible through the JSON, because they're on cards that simply haven't had to be translated yet. So you might come across an effect and be surprised to discover that it doesn't exist in the JSON. And it's a relatively straightforward operation for me to go in and add the wrapper, but it's not anything that I expect anyone else to be able to do. So if there's a card effect that you know already exists on a card from set 12 or whatever, but you don't see it, just let me know and I will go in and add it real quick. That sort of change, however, is going to require a server restart. You won't be able to do a stealth introduction of cards in that case. I mean, I think that's about it for cards. I highly well, actually, let me go over some of the change stuff that I want to do. So let me look at a recent one. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to introduce this card info section that is going to store like where the actual file is of the card.
And so that's a subpath for the image server I'm seeing. So I just have to look up a card image and then slap it in there.
Right.
Or
So
make one up and say, Ketchra, please add this in here.
well, sure. My big
Or add it
reason
myself.
for doing this is so that you can procedurally alter it.
Okay.
In particular, like it would be very, very useful if you could do stuff like on the fly generate new versions of cards, which is something that I want to be able to do eventually. We haven't needed to do something like that yet because we don't have a whole lot of variants. But if, for instance, we were to have that change to my cards that I keep talking about and alter, so make it so that people can make a masterwork out of anything if they pay enough gold, that sort of thing I would want to be able to be generated automatically. And if I'm going to do that, then I can't have manual entry of images like we have right now, because at the moment you have to go into async and you have to add an explicit link between the card ID and where that image is located. And so right here you can see this is all the PC cards that we've ever done. There's VSET 1 is in here, and we've got, so this is VSET 1 right there, and then all of our promos. There's a lot of promos, all the errata. It's a pain that I've got 500 lines here. There's nothing but storing those associations. I would very much like that to just be part of the card definition so that I don't have to fiddle around with that. Let me go back to where I was. And then parent stuff. So I want to be able to come in and define an errata without needing to copy paste the entire thing. Because right now, if I want to make an errata, you'll notice here that this is not set 9, this is set 79. I have a series of sets that are fake sets that are errata sets, basically. And so I can tell immediately just by looking at the ID whether or not it is an errata, whether or not it is a playtest errata. This one, for instance, is playtest. This is eggless. We didn't actually push that one all the way through. If it had been generated all the way to production, then it would be set 59. And that would be part of the errata set. I don't want to do this garbage of manually fiddling about with stuff. I would like to be able to just come onto a card and say, all right, here's the errata. It's going to be part of the PC group, because we might have decipher errata on here. We might have other people besides the PC that decide to start trying to create their own errata. And then we would just say, here's the differences. Like the effect is going to change to such and such. So take whatever the effect was and change it. All the other stuff is going to stay the same. But we're not copy pasting all that garbage. It's just going to be this one thing that gets altered. I would love to do the same thing with promos, so that literally the only thing that I have to change in there is, all right, we're just going to change the URL. Nothing else is changing. This is a masterwork. Otherwise, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
But
And literally all it requires is having them all generated beforehand in the image server.
well, I'm talking about if I'm coming. Well, yeah, sure. Like that basically reduces the amount of work that I have to do to release a new promo, to coming in here and adding the promo to the particular card's line item, and then generating the image and putting it in the right place. And those will be the only two things I have to do. Right now, there's about 5 different files that have to get altered before a new card can be introduced. Even just a regular promo card that doesn't actually have any new data with it or anything. But once I've figured out all those changes, I will be going through and updating all the existing JSON files, and then from there I'll start a push to converting set 2 and 3 and onward. But I'm not going to do that until I have figured out what all these changes need to be.
Yeah, because then you don't have to go back and change everything 3 different times.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, let me double check the questions that Llama had. He said, how do I launch an instance of the server? Let's see, did that one ever finish? Okay, so when you have successfully built a version of Gemp, this is what it's going to end up looking like. Normally, this process does not take this long. In fact, if I come over here and do a Maven install again, we should find this entire process take less than 30 seconds. It's going to go through and discover that none of the actual packages have changed since the last time that it was ran. And so about the only thing that it's going to end up doing is running the unit tests for it. Oh, unit tests. I will need to go over those in a moment. And in fact, that was his very next question. What is the testing process?
Yep.
Process?
And I was about to ask that too, because you always go on about the unit tests that need to be completed.
And I am pretty proud of those, so would hate to leave those out. Well, it takes 30 seconds on the production server. Maybe it's a little longer on my computer that's got way too many other things running. While I'm waiting on that, so the tests that are being ran will be within the Gemp Lotter server. This is... There are tests that exist in other packages, but I don't think that there are any that matter as far as Gemp is concerned. If these test cases fail, then it will not build, and it will prevent you from moving on. Even if the actual, well, I shouldn't say that. It will not finish the build, because by that point it will have compiled properly, but there will be something that indicates that something went wrong. So there are about 700 some odd tests in here. Well, actually, I think the number might be up to 800 or 900 at this point. And many of these were written by Marciness, and I haven't touched any of those, especially the ones that go over the tournament system and stuff like that. But here within the cards section, these are all tests that I have either made or transferred from other areas. So if we come over here and take a look, we'll see that there is one class of tests per card, basically. And I have another script that I use to run that generates all of this. In fact, if we come over here and look at set 2 or 3, this is the boilerplate that it ends up looking like. So here's a royal welcome. I've generated the boilerplate, but I haven't actually written the tests. That's what it looks like at first. But so how this works is that first you're going to go in and you are going to define the card itself. So the very first one I usually try to make. Oh, so let me back up here. This is the deck that is going to be used by either player. By convention, I just make it so that both players use the exact same deck. Since typically you are just going to be testing Free Peoples versus Shadow, it doesn't matter that we've got a mirror match going. And since this is a test rig and it is not a table, a formal table, you don't actually have to follow any of the format rules or anything like that. And in fact, you'll notice that this is not a legal deck. There are not 60 cards here. Anything that is enforced by a table is not enforced here. So if there was something that it would kick you back on the table and wouldn't let you create the table, none of that's enforced here. So I've got this
Hmm.
wimpy little deck here that has a Gimli, a Farron, Hospitality to the Dwarves. That's got to be what this one is testing. I've got 3 hand axes, and I have probably a Moria Archer troop. Um, I've set up that deck, and it's set up in a way that both players will have it. There's going to be a first test that first just goes through and tests all the individual aspects of the card. So we will check and see that the Twilight cost is defined the way that we expect it to be. We check that the card type is what we expect it to be, the culture is what we expect it to be, and so forth. We can test keywords, we can test all the different stats. There's some things that you can't test, like whether or not it has special abilities. That kind of thing is pretty much down to you actually writing out a test that performs some sort of action and seeing if it works. I don't want to do Hospitality of the Dwarves because that one requires sites, and site moving is complicated. Let's just go to Gimli. Where's the Gimli? Gimli, Vengeful Nogrim. Okay, so we check and see what his Twilight cost is, Strength, Vitality, Resistance. We see that he's got the Frodo Signet, all that kind of stuff. And then we have a couple of actual unit tests here. Gimli has Strength bonus with 2 items. Gimli has Damage bonus with 3 items. So if we look at the actual text, I believe it's while Gimli bears 2 items, he is Strength plus 2, while... Is it Strength plus 2? Yeah. And then he's Damage plus 1 while bearing 3 items. So what we do here is we first set up the game. So before the game has actually started, we can cheat a little bit. We can stack people's hands. We can put things on the table, but actually ignoring what their play requirements are. So I can put down a bunch of I can do crazy things like put the Pale Blade on Frodo or whatever, depending on what it is that I need to be doing. And so doing this, you can get around actually needing something to be kosher and be set up properly. So here, I pull instances of Gimli,
I'd assume that's Dwarven Axe.
Yeah, Dwarven Axe, Hand Axe, Ring. So up here, I've got Gimli, Dwarven Axe, Hand Axe, and a Ring. Okay, yeah, so I've just got 3 different items. And then I just move all 4 of those items to the Free People player's hand. Well, okay. So obviously both players can be either thing, but by convention, these tests assume that player 1 is the Free People's player and player 2 is the Shadow player. And all the naming conventions just follow that. One of the reasons that things that move through multiple sites get complicated is because then you have players switching roles, and then you have a bunch of code that says, make the Shadow player do this when they're actually the Free People's player. And yeah, that's kind of a weakness of the setup, but 90% of the time it works fine. Anyway, so once this section is hit where we are telling the scenario to start the game, now after this point everything has to be more or less kosher. When we perform actions, they are going to actually be executed by the logic engine, and it's going to throw a fit if we try to make decisions that are invalid and stuff like that. There's still a little bit of cheating that we can do. For instance, we can do stuff like add tokens, move things to different zones where they shouldn't be. But while you're doing that, the engine isn't actually aware of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just the back end,
Right.
not the actual images.
Well, right, yeah. None of this does anything with images. So yeah. So to run through this one real quick, we start the game, and then we have the Free People's player play a card. We tell them to play Gimli from their hand. If Gimli was not in their hand, or if there were other play requirements, it would throw a fit at this point. And then we do some assertions. So we're going to check and see that after we played Gimli, there should be 2 Twilight in the Twilight pool. If this is false, then it throws an error. And then we're also going to double check and make sure that Gimli's strength by default is 6, because we're going to be manipulating that. So first, we're going to play the Dwarven Axe on Gimli, and we're going to check and see what his strength is. So we're going to assert that it should be 8. It should be his base strength of 6 plus 2 from the axe. And then we're going to play the Dwarven Axe. Oh, sorry, hang on. We did the Dwarven Axe. Oh, then we're going to play the ring. We're going to play one of those Dwarven rings on him. So we've got a base of 6. We've got 2 from the Dwarven Axe, and we've got plus 1 from the ring. So by default, that would be 6, 7, 8, 9. But because of his game text, where if he's got at least 2 items on him, then he should have plus 2 from the game text. So we're going to check and make sure that it is 11. And if it's not 11, then it throws a fit. So if we had messed up that particular game text, or if it had failed to compile for whatever reason, then this would blow up as a test when when trying to run it. Yeesh. So here we can actually see that there are some of these tests that are running, like the archery. I don't know what AT stands for. Automated tournament? He uses it in a lot of places. Transfer at test. So he has a bunch of his tests, and then I think a lot of my tests run after this. But so one of the things I would also recommend is that you go get IntelliJ IDEA. That's what this particular IDE is. It works pretty well. I can do stuff like I'm going to come over here and I'm going to right click on this Java folder that just contains all of the tests, and I can hit run. And it will do an operation that is very similar to what is being ran on the container right now, where it will build all the code, and then it will run all the tests and give us a little readout for what exactly went wrong. You could do this on whatever level you need to, so you can say I want to run everything that's in this particular file. I can come over here and I can say just run this particular test. So if there's one test that you're running, you can say, I just want to test this one and make sure that it works.
It does seem to be running a lot faster than the container is, though.
Yep. Container's got limited access to the power of my machine, but this is being ran by me, so. Oop. 3 tests failed. Looks like we have broke the 900 test barrier. 956. Okay, let's see. A talent for not being seen is not working. Oh, I know what this is. It's because the playtest version is different from what this was expecting. Because the playtest version now requires you to exert.
Oh, right, we didn't push that out all the way.
Yeah, we didn't push that out. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to change the reference here to the live version. And then if we rerun just this class, it'll run just these 3. Oh, no, I had already started to alter these. Talent exerts and plays on Mary or Pippin. So yeah, I didn't like that. It got all the way up to the point where it was checking to see, is there a wound on Mary from the exertion, and it failed at that point. So at this point, you know that there's something up with the particular code that you're using. Another thing that's very powerful with this is, let me debug. So rather than running the test, you can debug the test. And when you do this, this allows you to inspect the actual game state of what is actually happening on the server. And this can be super duper useful. So I have a couple of pinned sections up here. I'm going to ignore them for now because you won't have them. But it's the scenario object here. We can come on here and we can open up, the 2 important ones are game and user feedback. So game is going to be the game state. So game is itself going to be talking about meta levels, like is it canceled, is it finished. Basically this is more the table actually. And then game state is going to be everything we care about inside the game. So here's an array of both decks. I can come in here and inspect it and see that player 1 has a deck that is currently empty, and player 2 has a deck that currently has 5 cards in it, and it's these 5 specific cards. This sort of thing can be very, very useful when trying to debug why exactly you got the effect that you did. Like, how do we get to this point? Like, what happened to the burden that I added? Like, I can come down to the tokens, I think it is, card tokens. And we can see that one of them is a burden. Oh, right. So, yeah. This particular card has 1 burden, and the other card has... Yeah. So, one player has 1 burden, and the other player has 0 burdens. So, being able to inspect that at a fine level, I've spent a lot of time just clicking through this giant tree and trying to understand exactly what's going on. But then the other one that I mentioned, the user feedback, a good way to think of the game server is that it is going to run as much as it possibly can until it gets to a point where a player has to make a decision. And then it will go back to the client and it will say, this is the type of decision that's being made. Here's the text. Here's the different choices that the player has. I want you to resolve this. And it will just sit there and spin while waiting. And that's exactly what's happened here. So we have started the game and we are in the fellowship action, and we can see here. So if I minimize this actually, if we look at the awaiting decision map, it says that it is waiting on player 1 to do something, which we know is the Free People's player. So I can come here and open up the value, and we can look at the text, and it says play fellowship action or pass. So there's going to be some sort of actions that it can do. If we look in the parameters, we can see the different action texts, that there are 3 different actions, valid actions that are available. Play Sam, son of Hamfast, play Mary, play Pippin. All those cards are in the hand, and those are 3 options that they have. You could, of course, also pass, which returns a 0 for everything. And yeah, so this can be very important when trying to step through, trying to figure out what exactly happened. Why did something fail? If we had the reverse situation here, where it exerted and you weren't expecting that, the way that I would expect this to work is that you would get to this point and it would fail, but when we looked inside the user feedback, we would see something that says choose which hobbit to exert, and it's waiting on that decision. And since we don't have code with that decision, it doesn't know what to do, and so it blows up when you try to make an invalid decision later on.
Okay.
So this is kind of a lot, I think, to to talk about, just because there's so many different things going on in here. I would highly advise just looking at the existing unit tests, the real ones. There's a few of these that I've checked in, unfortunately, that are just kind of boilerplate, especially for the errata. I am in the process of trying to fix that and getting all the errata squared away. But you can definitely look at all of the V cards. Every single V card has a set of unit tests. All of Fellowship of the Ring is finished, so all of our errata are in here. I have gone through and made unit tests for some of the official ones. In some cases, it's because there was a bug that I was fixing, and so I ended up translating the card from regular to JSON. And actually, this is super duper useful for that, because first I write the tests with the Java card, for all the different things that I expect that card to be able to do. And then I implement it in JSON, and then I delete the Java one, and then we rerun the exact same test to see if it still passes all those tests. It's been a rather foolproof way of converting stuff, actually. And because the concept of unit tests is something that a lot of programmers frown on, this system has saved my butt more than once when I have needed to change some functionality at a deep level of the server, and I screwed it up. And then I go to rerun those 900 tests, and I have like 400 of them fail. And I go, awesome, excellent. I don't have to wait for Gemp to blow up and someone to come to me. I have a bunch of these unit tests that are all failing, and it allows me to triangulate on what exactly the problem is. So I'm quite proud of the card testing system here. I think that this is a lot of this is the way it is because of stuff that I've written. This generic card test helper is kind of an enormous fustercluck, kind of like I was talking about before with a bajillion things in it. These are all just helper functions, really. Get the Free People's discard count. If you want to know how many cards are in their discard pile, that's something that I end up doing a lot, so I've got a helper function for it. Move a Free People's card to hand. Free People's player needs to move cards to the top of their deck, and just give me a list of what cards need to be moved there. All kinds of manipulation things are in here. And again, this is the sort of thing I would just advise you to read through some of the tests and see how it's set up. Aragorn has Ranger. Why is that? Oh man, this has got to be an old test. Aragorn stats and keywords are correct. I'm going to have to recheck some of these, because that's the sort of thing that I would put just into this stat checking thing nowadays. And it looks like it is there. Yeah, I will definitely need to double check some of these older ones. Okay, so this, let me just roll back over then to the getting this actually set up. So we have saved our Docker Compose. We've uncommented that particular command. We have Gemp actually building. It didn't take nearly as long this time. I didn't watch it the whole time, but it was not 15 minutes. And then Docker Compose down. Oh, misspelled it. Docker Compose down. It's taking a minute to shut down. Oh, it might be because I'm still in there. Yep. Docker Compose up D.
So will this actually create an instance that is like the Gemp that I can just go into my browser and open?
Yep.
Okay.
And in fact, so this particular one is on 17.0.0.1, so I should just be able to go to localhost. Something's up. And I don't know what, because this is a blank screen as opposed to a 404. This probably has nothing to do with the actual setup and has something to do with the fact that I am flip-flopping between two different instances of Gemp on my computer and I have screwed up the configuration somewhere.
What should pop up is basically the browser that we all see. Okay.
Yep, yeah. And in fact, it's the exact same thing that you see, whoops, not at this one, at the different playtest instances. These are all just pointed to particular containers, right? There's nothing fancy going on. There are a handful of functions that will not work because they have to have a web server configured. For instance, this may be a bit of a surprise, but deck sharing will not work. Because
that is interesting.
Because I have a custom, well, it's because the URL that Gemp generates for that is very ugly, and I don't want that to be the one that everyone uses. So I have an alias on, so that it's just like what is the actual? Where's a deck that somebody shared recently? I know that guy was talking about it on deck discussion. So you see how the URL is just share deck question ID equals this. That's fairly straightforward, and just about anybody looking at that could understand what's going on. But the actual URL that is used by Gemp is much more hideous and difficult to understand what's going on. So I have some custom alias rules on our web server that detect the hideously ugly, that take this and translate it to the hideously ugly version for Gemp itself to understand. But if you don't have those translation rules installed at the level of your web browser, or of the actual server, then it won't actually function. So don't try to share decks. I don't think that there's anything else like that that doesn't work. That was really just more of a vanity thing. But I'll have to figure out what exactly is going on with my local host and maybe re-record just a small walkthrough just to see what everything looks like. But it's just it's a standard instance when it's working.
Okay. Yeah, I think the knowledge of like how to code cards is going to come in useful since the two projects that I'm involved with involve that.
Yeah. And I would definitely recommend doing that and then just going in and running a test somewhere. So just to show off what that looks like here, let me come over here and run just one of these, any test actually, not even a test necessarily written for the new card that you were doing. But you can see here how it's loading up all these JSON card files and everything. And so this is part of the readout, right? So if I were to come into our definitions, let's just take one of those dwarven errata. Okay, so dwarf guard. We are going to screw up dwarf guard here. We are going to do something illegal. What should I do? I want to do something that, well, actually, I think I'll just do something like add in additional braces so that it's an invalid definition, right? And then if I come in here and rerun this, it's not going to affect Aragorn because Aragorn's not in that file. But if we scroll up here in the readout, boom, we should start to see some errors. So we have unexpected error while parsing file dwarven errata. So in this particular case, we have a completely invalid JSON. Oh, I could just rename this to something that doesn't exist, I believe. So it used to be called condition back in the day, right? So that is valid JSON, but it's going to be an invalid definition. So unrecognized field condition. It tried to load the JSON and didn't know what to do with it. Now, again, and so it says unable to load card 517. So that's where you know that, okay, I need to go back in and find 517 and figure out what it is that I screwed up. And so this is where the JSON, the JSON specification can really help you. Is taking a look to see in there, well, okay, if condition isn't correct, then in my top level blueprint, what is it supposed to be called? And you can come through here and realize, oh, there is no condition. Actually, it's supposed to be called requires. So yeah, highly recommended. Running all this just in IDEA, and that'll let you test out your cards even without writing unit tests. And here we can see that, yeah, that now it's loading perfectly fine. There's no errors showing up here in the log. But yeah, so I think that's just about everything that I had to present, really. It was kind of all over the place, and I apologize for that. Part of it's the heat in here. Part of it's, I don't know, just being out of it on a 3-day weekend. So I don't know how useful this recording is going to be for all that many people. I probably need to make an actual formative one that's designed, that goes through and hits points and is more succinct. But any last questions?
Well, at least now I know. No, I think I'm good.
All right, I'll go ahead and stop the recording then.